You've seen the headlines, right? Trade wars. But what's really going on behind all the politics? Well, it's not just politics. It's a massive chain reaction, a global shockwave that starts on a factory floor and ends up shaking the entire world. In this explainer, we're going to follow that ripple effect, step by step.
So that brings us to the big question, the one we're really digging into today. What happens when trade, the very engine that powers our global economy, gets turned into a weapon? It forces us to look way past the tariffs and to the much, much deeper consequences.
Okay, first things first. Let's get our terms straight. A trade war isn't just some economic squabble. I mean, look at the US-China conflict. It shows this perfectly. This is a geopolitical instrument. It's all about using economic tools to fight for much bigger prizes. Things like who's going to be the leader in tech or who's going to dominate the industries of the future.
All right, so where does that first ripple actually hit the water? Well, it lands right on the factory floor. We're going to start by looking at the immediate corporate response, how companies are forced to react when the rulebook for global trade basically gets torn up overnight.
I mean, just put yourself in a CEO's shoes for a second. One day, everything is chugging along, and the next, bam, your costs have skyrocketed, your key suppliers are suddenly in a targeted country, and your whole business model is at risk. We're not talking about a minor tweak here. You are forced to fundamentally redesign your entire global supply chain. It's an absolute massive scramble for survival.
But here's the thing. That scramble isn't just pure chaos. There's actually a method to the madness. Research based on interviews with about 40 senior executives found that there's a pretty clear decision path they follow. It really boils down to two key questions. First, how intense is the government pressure really? And second, how easily can our suppliers and our assets actually move? The answers to those two questions determine the entire strategy.
And this is where it gets really interesting because it all comes down to this one core tension. If your suppliers are basically bolted to the floor, they have low mobility, they can't move, then your only option is to play defense. You focus on stability, you hunker down, you try to mitigate the risk. But if you have options, if your assets are mobile, you go on offense. You pursue flexibility, agility. You build a supply chain that can pivot on a dime.
Okay, but let's be real. Rewiring an entire global factory, that is not cheap. And that leads us to the second ripple, the money. All of these massive physical changes require some immense financial dexterity, and that starts a whole new chain reaction in the world of finance.
Which brings us to maybe the most practical question of all, right? How in the world do these companies actually pay for all this? How do they find the cash to survive such a massive, unexpected disruption?
Well, for many, the answer is a lifeline called supply chain financing. You can think of it as a set of financial tools designed to inject critical cash or liquidity right into the system where it's needed most. It helps suppliers get paid faster and gives buyers more flexible terms, basically keeping the entire chain from seizing up.
But just getting your hands on cash is only half the battle. Managing that cash, what's known as working capital, is a complete tightrope walk. You need enough to operate and handle shocks, but just holding on to too much cash is actually really inefficient. And some fascinating new research actually discovered what's called a U-shaped problem here. On one side of the U, if your working capital, your available cash, is too low, you just can't invest or weather storms. As you see, profitability suffers. It's a very dangerous place to be.
But then, and this is the counterintuitive part, here's the other side of that U. If you hoard too much cash, holding extremely high levels of working capital, that money's just sitting there. It's not invested, it's not generating returns, and guess what? It drags your profitability down too. It's just inefficient.
So the crucial point is that financial survival in a trade war isn't just about having cash, it's about having the right amount of cash. Finding that perfect liquidity sweet spot, that's what separates the companies that survive from the ones that falter.
Okay, so we've seen how companies react, and we've followed the money trail. Now it's time to zoom all the way out to the final and widest ripple. After the businesses react and the money moves, entire nations respond. And this is where corporate survival tactics escalate into a full-blown geopolitical chessboard.
This quote here, inspired by recent research, perfectly captures this shift in scale. Trade wars are never just about trade. They are a battlefield for much, much bigger prizes. Who will lead in technology and who will dominate the industries of the future. That's the real game. And on this chessboard, governments deploy a whole toolkit of moves. Tariffs are usually the opening shot, meant to protect strategic industries. Then comes monetary policy, like changing interest rates, to stabilize their own economy.
They use fiscal spending to cushion the blow for their citizens. And crucially, they start forging new trade agreements, building new alliances to counterbalance the old ones.
So after following these ripples from a single company all the way up to the global system, what's the bottom line? Let's quickly recap the key takeaways.
Here's the whole story in 3 steps. First, the geopolitical shock forces a physical redesign of how things are made and moved around the world. Second, that redesign is impossible without financial resilience. Getting the money right is absolutely critical for survival. And finally, these individual struggles scale up to the national level, where governments use that complex policy toolkit to wage the conflict and manage the consequences.
And that leaves us with one last big question. For decades, the goal was ultimate efficiency, a seamless, borderless global factory. But as these geopolitical shockwaves become more and more common, you have to ask yourself, is that era over? Are we moving into a new world where resilience, not just efficiency, is the real name of the game? That's something to think about.